Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Since 2013, Bombas has donated over 100 million socks, underwear, and T-shirts to those facing homelessness. If we counted those on air, this ad would last over 1,157 days. But if we counted the time it takes to make a donation possible, it would take just a few clicks. Because every time you make a purchase, Bombas donates an item to someone who needs it.
Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
Hello and welcome to the Napoleonicist. Today I am joined once again by the deeply knowledgeable, much loved master of adventures in Historyland, Josh Provan, because Josh has a book out that I think folk are going to be very interested in. It's called Bullocks, Grain and Good Madeira. That was Bullocks, I emphasize that pronunciation heavily, and covers the campaigns that contain the Battle of Assaye and the Siege of Gawilghur, the contests which sharp fans and Napoleonic era enthusiasts will know all too well as key engagements involving Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. Josh, it's always great to have you on. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I'm looking forward to seeing how people respond to the book. It's been a while in coming, so exciting time.
It's actually your second book, isn't it? Because you did Wild East, which is about the situation out in the Far East in the sort of mid-Victorian period. Folks, shameless plug for this book, Wild East. It's in the Napoleonicist bookshop. There's a link down below if you're watching this on YouTube, or it's in the description if you're listening to it. Click the link. You'll find it in the featured on the podcast list. Go and buy the book. You know Josh by now. He's a lovely individual, very knowledgeable. He's smiling sweetly at you to try and persuade you to buy this thing. Honestly, it's well worth it. And then in the process, if you use that link, not only will he actually get some royalties, and believe me, we do not go into this business of history to make money, but also the Napoleonicist will get a cut as well. Not his cut, but it will get a cut nonetheless. So you'll be supporting two individuals who will be much obliged to you. So we've sold Wild East. Hopefully by the time this goes out, the book will either be days away from publication or it will be published. So again, go have a look in the bookshop off the back of this interview and buy it because it's got all the makings of a fantastic book. I've seen the pre-proof version and it's stellar.
The horrendous pre-corrected version.
I mean, I wasn't going to sort of point out all of the spelling mistakes, you know. I'm kidding, folks.
With a crayon that I wrote with a crayon. How do you spell?
I mean, I had hoped that you might be able to spell war by your age, but you know.
What? There's not an H in it somewhere?
No. But anyway, let's get down to some history. So, set the scene for us. What's the political scene in India at this point of the Maratha and the Jat campaigns? Because this is a complex world. You've got warring Indian kingdoms, you've got embryonic European empires trying to insert themselves into the subcontinent. You've got I say the growing East India Company, but actually in many respects, East India Company is quite well fledged by this point. So talk us, in fact, we're only 50 years away from its collapse post-India mutiny. So,
Mm.
you know, the EIC, as I tend to call it, is well established. So you've got a lot going on here. Give us a flavour of this sort of maelstrom of political manoeuvring.
I'll have a go. And I have to say that when I was researching the book, it is really fascinating to see how the war comes about. It's almost more fascinating than the actual war itself, to see how the war comes about. And I'm sad that I couldn't sort of cover this really, really complicated topic in a book about the war, because otherwise I would never have written about the war. But as of the beginning of the Second Mahratta War, this is the general picture. So a century or more of turmoil and power shifts have seen the complete disintegration of the Mughal Empire, which by 1800 was now just a tool for anyone to use to bolster their legitimacy as a leader in India. That role was currently fulfilled by the Maratha Confederacy, which is a group of powerful Hindu states that had banded together in the 17th century and had grown to dominate most of northern India. The other power in India in 1800 is the British East India Company, EIC, Honourable Company, Company Badahur, whatever, which had emerged from a troubled period in the late 18th century, having defeated the Muslim ruler of Mysore and made a vital alliance with the old Mughal state of Hyderabad, without whom they could not have established themselves as they did. The British were progressing in what was known as the forward policy at this time. This was an aggressive expansion of British political control over the independent rulers of the country, the, in quotes, country powers, as they called them. It was masterminded by the British Governor General at Fort William in Bengal, Lord Richard Wellesley, who had a scheme to remove the other European rulers of the country, the other European contenders, in the country, basically the French. He was deeply phobic about the French in India, and he felt that the way to secure British interests and get rid of the French was essentially just for the British to run everything. Simple. And but of course there was another, he did have another motive as well, which is based on most British administrators' obsession with trying to establish some kind of order and stability in the world. It can be argued that even the Napoleonic Wars themselves were the British trying to stabilize Europe after the French Revolution. Well, this would be Richard Wellesley trying to stabilize India after about 30 years of continuous upheaval to do with various rather complicated politics within the country. So he therefore employs what he called the subsidiary system. So as I said, since the 1770s in the northern and central zones of India, and even down into the south, there has been just an endless period of conflict and deprivation, building to a height in the 80s and 90s, when tracts of land became so depopulated that, through various conflicts and famines, that wild animals began to re-inhabit areas that had once been populated by humans. The cycle of violence did often hinge around the EIC, but also the Marathas, Mysore, and the Nizam of Hyderabad separately. And the crisis of the 1780s had seen the EIC also drawn further and further under the control of Westminster. And Wellesley thought that if the company could take control of the subcontinent, obviously, they could make all these troubles go away. Now, that's a nice idea, flourishing states and stuff, but under a peaceful and benign overlord. But at the same time, it's just basically, the imperial aspiration syndrome at the same time, because that is going to require you to take control of a lot of places that people don't want you to take control of. And So hence, but whatever, that was his plan, and he was the Governor General, and everybody else who could have stopped him was thousands of miles away, months to get a letter back to London. And so he embarked on this subsidiary plan. And a subsidiary alliance is basically that you go to an independent ruler and you make a treaty with him, and he hands over the defense of his country to you, and his foreign policy as well. So basically he can't go to war anymore, and he can't defend himself. You do it for him. He becomes your ward, basically. As of 1800, this system was working. It was achieving the goal of making British power paramount. And by the time the last major power theoretically capable of opposing the British in the south had fallen, which is obviously Mysore in 1799, there was no one left to actually really properly oppose the British, because the French went out when Hyderabad became an ally of the British, and they had only a small enclave now in India, and they really didn't count anymore. And I mean, of course, the revolution, of course, ended pretty much any organized attempts to try and colonize India from the French perspective as well. But the only nation left in India after the fall of Mysore in 99 was the Marathas. And unfortunately for the Marathas, the state was a fractured thing, with the last of the great statesmen like Mahadaji Shind and Nana Fadnavis passing away and leaving all but one of the major confederates under the rule of young, ambitious, and in some cases, mostly inept men. Ostensibly, the Confederacy was led by the Peshwa in Pune, a position that had once been the prime minister of their overlord, the Chhatrapati, who was a defunct, now mostly ceremonial guy who lived in a fortress, I believe it's Satara. And he doesn't play really much of a role in politics anymore. It's all the Peshwa. And unfortunately, the Peshwa is a young man by the name of Bajirao II, the son of a hated former Peshwa, who is now in exile, having sparked the First Mahratta War with the British under frighteningly similar circumstances. He tried to exert his dominance over the other Maratha Maharajas, especially the Maharaja of Gwalior, Daulat Rao Shind, who had the most powerful army in the Confederacy, and he was Bajirao's self-proclaimed protector, because, well, he had the best army when the power vacuums began to pull. And he went over to Pune and he established himself there, and he said, I'll just take over running things now. You just do whatever the heck you want and I'll take care of things. And, well, that didn't really work out very well, because the destabilized state became all the more so when Daulat Rao tried to do this, because he also had this ridiculous, completely Machiavellian father-in-law who got him entangled in a war with his father's wives, which caused immense amount of trouble and an outright war within the Gwalior state. And then he tried to destroy the Maharajas of Indore. One of the other main Maratha leaders were the Maharajas of Indore, the Holkar family, and he basically tried to purge them, and he did this by taking advantage of a succession crisis where the Holkars came to Pune to try and get mediation, and he basically massacred a bunch of them. And unfortunately for him, he didn't kill the guy he needed to kill, whose name was Yashwantrao Holkar. And we'll get to him later, but basically another terrible civil war breaks out as Holkar goes on this amazing kind of epic journey, gets knocked down, comes back up, gets knocked down again, and it somehow manages to get an army together, get to the gates of Pune itself, attack the Peshwas and Shind's army, and beats it, and puts Baji-Rao's brother on the throne, or the Masnud, as it's called in Indian circles, which is the low cushioned throne that most Maharajas sit on. And this now gets even worse, because what does Baji-Rao do? He doesn't run to safety with his ally Shind, who he doesn't trust. He goes like a rabbit out of Maratha territory to the British, like his dad did. And he goes to the British and he says, I've been kicked out of my country. You've always wanted to have a resident in my country. You've always wanted this dumb subsidiary treaty with me. If you put me back in Pune, I'll sign one of those with you. And Richard Wellesley's like, yes, excellent, brilliant idea. And so they sign a treaty at a place called Bassein in I believe it's December of 1802, and basically a massive mobilization of British and company troops takes place across the borders of British territories. And the Nizam also mobilizes his troops in Hyderabad. And from this massive army that gets mobilized to attack the Marathas, we turn to, I believe it's the Commander-in-Chief of Bombay, assigns a forward detachment under the command of an obscure but talented Major General by the name of Arthur Wellesley, who happens to also be quite well connected.
Who? Never heard of him before.
He's only a name in India. Nobody cares about him outside of India. It doesn't matter. India officers, nobody cares about India officers.
Well, it was a place where, as folks who've read Rory Muir's book, Gentlemen of Uncertain Fortune will know, it's a place where actually you took a massive gamble, because you could go out to India and die out there and not be able to afford your own passage back. So, so he's an army officer, so potentially he can, and he's rich and well connected, so he can afford his passage back. But nonetheless, in an era before vaccination, etc., the risk of disease was substantial. Josh, that was just talk of force. Yeah. Thank you for that. And what I like about that is that I think you are very fair in highlighting the fact that actually the British were pretty scumbaggy during this period. There's no sugarcoating it. There's no apologizing for it. People who are listening might go, oh, but it was the era of empires and therefore it's okay. No, that doesn't excuse it.
No, not at all. I mean, even at the time, people thought this was dodgy. I mean, you have the trial of Warren Hastings going on almost just if it's just over, it has been going on for ridiculous length of time. You've got people basically asking, why on earth is there more troops in India than we have under arms in Britain? What is going on in India? It's a huge actual conversation going on at the moment about what is going on in India and why it is happening.
And what's really odd about this, because folks might not be aware about it, is that you've got British Regular Army out there, but you've also got the East India Company Army, which is part of the reason why the numbers are so large, because the army, the EIC army, is governed in terms of its size, but it's governed separately to the British Regular Force. And the idea is that the two will supplement one another. So let's sort of drill down into this a little bit. Let's talk about the European side, first of all. Well, I say European side, but actually that's probably a disingenuous term to use when we're talking about the EIC army, because actually, what do the EIC army do? A lot of the time, they recruit native residents under some interesting kind of arrangements about boundaries of where these individuals will serve. So talk us through British, in inverted commas, forces, first of all, during this period.
Okay, so the British forces consist of the British Army in India and the armies of the three presidencies of the East India Company. The presidency armies are, except for a handful of European regiments and specialists, made up of sepoy regiments, sepoy being the corruption of the Persian sipahi, which means soldier. And except for senior officers, these regiments are entirely made up of Indians, each having a senior Indian officer who was the most important man in the regiment, as that he bridged the gap between the men and the officers. Even today in the Gurkha regiments, which are the closest thing still existing to the old sort of company regiments, you have a colonel in charge, a British colonel usually, and a senior Gurkha officer. And the working relationship between these two men are vital to the effectiveness of the regiment. The Indian cavalry has a similar model, but with different names, and both broadly conformed to the British battalion and squadron system in some way or another. Although there are no Royal Artillery batteries in India at this time, it should be said. There are company artillery, which, except for what were called the shot carriers, who helped haul, move, and service the guns, all of these were Europeans, because there was a stigma about allowing Indians to have possession of artillery within the company, because they were basically afraid that if a mutiny happened, they could blow them all to kingdom come. So don't teach the Indians how to use the cannons, please, is what they were saying. Although these shot carriers would actually fight the guns if the Europeans ended up being all shot to pieces. So it's a confusing thing. The British, which in Indian circles, the British regiments are called the King's Forces, so King's regiments. And if you read in the book, you have to specify HM in front of every time you use a British regimental number, because you're going to get confused between the various native regiments and the British ones if you don't. People will be familiar with the makeup of these regiments. They're by 10 companies, etc., lieutenant colonels, majors. I think at this stage there's mostly just one battalion regiment in the army. Oddly, there is not a great deal of light infantry work done in India for some reason. Light companies are a thing, but they don't really do much light bobbing out in India. It's very rare you read of the sort of European style or North American style skirmishing in India. And I've not really figured out why, but I think it's something to do with the way that British tactical doctrine had developed in India, and we'll get to that later. But these British King's forces, although always smaller in terms of the amount of battalions and squadrons that were actually available to the East India Company, they were usually relied on the most by British generals in command of the forces, until they actually got fighting and they realized actually you can rely quite a lot on the sepoys as well. But usually the British would favor the King's regiments, and they would take appalling casualties usually as a result of that. Now, if we turn over to the Marathas, you have a whole different ball of wax entirely. The Marathas were a mix of old and new. They were a feudal levy mixed with an aristocratic elite on the one side, the best of which was reflected in the mounted arm. The Marathas has always been great horsemen, and this was again reflected in the various grades of cavalry they used. They had all sorts of cavalry designated up to ridiculous amounts of equipment almost, and how much money they were sort of worth. You had at the lowest level pindaris, which are basically freebooters for hire, who are kind of like Cossacks, but before the Russians organized them. And then you had guys who, for instance, would come with their weapons, but would be given a horse by the state to ride. And then you had guys who came with weapons and their own horses, and they got different levels of pay. And they were also, therefore, of various levels of reliability. And the best of the cavalry the Marathas used were the ones that were usually paid by the independent Maharajas. So the ones that they paid and equipped directly were always the best ones. And also the regular cavalry. And that brings up the very interesting facet that on the one hand, you had the old style Marathas army, and then you had a kind of a new army. In the 18th century, into this had been injected a shot of conventional European doctrine. The Marathas, like most of the, in quotes, country powers, maintained what the British and many of the Marathas' own officers called a regular corps. This was a sepoy army, which replicated the British model and was officered by a collection of French, Swiss, German, Italian, British, and mixed race men. This was formed by a meeting of the minds between Mahadaji Shind and a soldier of fortune of French origin, I believe, maybe Swiss actually, called Benoit Dubois. And the force they formed in sort of the mid-late 18th century was to become the most professional and best equipped independent force in India. I should stress here that by this point, almost every independent state had one of these. Hyderabad had a French one until the British kicked it out. And Tipu even formed one himself of a sepoy corps. And the force was as well the largest one, formed into brigade type units which they called campus, which is a Portuguese word, with attached artillery and a squadron of cavalry, and they were kind of organized along European lines. And it's a little difficult to just kind of to pierce as to what that really looked like, because if the commander of the Red Corps was a Frenchman, it would usually be reorganized to work like French battalions. And if it was a British guy or a guy who had served in the British Army, it would suddenly switch slightly to become more British. So it's a little confusing and a very fascinating topic. And there's actually some really interesting things to read about this regular corps. But I just mentioned artillery back there, and this is another key thing about the Marathas. They had excellent artillery. It was extremely powerful, extremely large, and extremely well served. And because the Indian states had realized fairly early on that they could make really good artillery, and artillery was very powerful. So a lot of the Indian states really, really believed in the power of artillery. They would agree completely with Napoleon that it is with guns that war is made. And that has obviously its advantages and disadvantages. It means that you can really pummel an opponent, but it also means it's going to slow you down quite a lot. And in addition to large artillery trains, you also have to deal with the fact that in India, you are followed around by a walking city about two times the size of your own fighting force. And there's almost nothing you can do about that. Even the British ended up with this system. And it's just something you had to get used to organizing. Nobody ever got rid of it. It was just how war was done in India. And it was people, there's great accounts of people, sort of awed accounts of people watching an army get on the march in India, because it was really quite a sight to see. But going back to the Maratha regulars for a second, it's good to remember, because they're highly denigrated because the British did defeat them. People will argue with you online and stuff like that. Oh, the British, didn't do it. It was easy to fight in India. Indians don't know how to fight. They just walked over them. Absolutely not the case. These guys were professional, hardened soldiers, and we will tell you why they failed to defeat the British in this war. But at the second, they were well established. They had their own traditions of service. And in its heyday, I think it was actually more than a match for the company army.
Absolutely. Again, thank you for that, Josh, because there are so many questions that come out of this. And I like what you picked up on there, that, this was not some kind of walkover. This was not a fait accompli. If you want an indication of how well the local Indian forces fought, consider the fact that the British are quite happy to draft local sepoys into the East India Company army, despite the fact that they are fighting against their own countrymen in some instances. So this idea that, there somehow wasn't some very strong fighting spirit amongst the people who had been struggling with one another over various different conflicts over the course of however many years.
War is not new in India. War is not new in India.
And the British start coming out with things like martial race theory, where they think that specific peoples admittedly they apply this back home. So they think the Highlanders, for example, are particularly adept at fighting. But in India, they take that principle and they apply it themselves out there. And they start to think that certain individuals from certain sections of society, certain castes, and from certain geographical regions are particularly adept at fighting. So this idea that, the Indian people were not capable of fighting a campaign is just an absurdity. Let me drill into that caste question first of all, because this is one of the things that I'm really interested in my own kind of dabblings with India. And I must admit, I'm only in very sort of early stages of understanding this, but it's always struck me as something that was quite a challenge for the British out in India when they were recruiting the locals, because the whole point about the army is that you are of uniform rank within your own section. So if you're privates, you're all of equal importance, and ditto all the way up all the other ranks. So when you've got two people of the same caste, of different castes in the same rank, what kind of social challenges does that pose, and how does the EIC try to defray that?
The structure of how caste works in the EIC forces rather varies depending on the presidency you're in. It is not as regulated and considered, and is not as considered as important as it becomes later. At this period, you're still in this kind of fluctuation period where things are moving out from we are in India, part of India, working within India, to we run India kind of thing. And so caste in terms of people of the same rank with different castes is a problem that has to be worked with within the boundaries within the East India Company system. But it is generally done in the case that, well, first of all, it's most common in Bengal, where there are a lot of high caste sepoys, and in the Madras and Bombay presidencies, it's not as much of a problem, and indeed nobody really cares a great deal about it there. But in Bengal, it's got around essentially by the selective promotion, I believe, where you just are very careful to keep particular officers within the units they come into, which obviously already they have felt comfortable with enlisting in. Because if you take caste very seriously, as some high caste Hindus did, then you won't join a regiment that has a significantly that would damage that, because it is a deeply problematic thing, the caste system, to your own spiritual well-being, and there's a whole bunch of very, very strict laws that you have to follow if you want to follow it. So, but at this period, I would say it isn't as marked as it becomes, certainly.
I'm conscious that we spent a lot of time talking about the build-up and the preparation. So why don't we jump into some of the action, and particularly the big names that folks will be familiar with. Top of the list there, of course, has to be Assaye, and that remarkable move by Wellington to try and turn his enemy's flank, sort of successfully. I mean, admittedly, the Marathas do redeploy, but they covered a ford. Wellington just picks out his own ford. It's now, is it still named after him? Is it still Wellesley Ford?
Actually, I don't know. That's actually the first time I've heard that it is named after him, actually.
Perhaps I've got that wrong, but I seem to remember reading that somewhere. Folks will no doubt shout at me if they.
It may well have. It would make sense if it was. He was in India, quite a well-known name. There are actually even. There was a trinket trade that went on after he left India, of Duke of Wellington, like sculptures and things of Wellesley Saab and stuff like that. So it's possible. I just hadn't heard of it before.
But the point is that he then uses that ford as an alternative route to cross the river and then turn the enemy's flank, and they haven't covered that for whatever reason. So give folks a quick summary of the battle and how it plays out.
Okay. Well, Assaye's obviously the big one. That's the one. If you know about the Mahratta War, Second Mahratta War, it's probably because you've heard of Assaye and the Duke of Wellington. Most of the accounts of it come from his biographies. Assaye, though, was a rude shock to General Wellesley, and it was a supreme test of his ability to improvise an ever-changing situation. After chasing the Marathas across rivers and plains and doubling back and rushing forward, the British were finally getting close to actually getting a general action. They were just days away, actually, from the enemy. Unfortunately, to march faster and increase chances of catching the enemy, Wellesley kept his forces split. One column under Colonel Stevenson separated from him by about a day's march and a strata of upland. So the plan, obviously, by extension of that, is that we march separated and fight concentrated. So one of us will catch him and the other one will come and help. Unfortunately, at the end of the marching day, about 12 p.m., he heard that the enemy were actually very close and preparing to break camp. Wellesley was absolutely fed up by this point of chasing the Marathas around the country, and he had been itching for a fight. The bits in the dispatches at this point are all about, I'm going to fight the Marathas, I'm going to catch them, I'm going to do, he absolutely wants a battle, and he's afraid he's going to lose them again. So at once he throws caution to the wind and decides to attack alone. But then he finds the enemy in a massive strength, confined within what in India was called a doab, which is a piece of land enclosed on three sides by the confluence of two rivers. He forded into the river, as you said, when no one thought he could do so. He was very proud of this in later life, and he thought it was an extreme example of just common sense, basically, of the way he found it, because he noticed there was a town on the other side of the river, and he said, well, no moron is going to build a town there without having a way to get across the blinking river, so go find the ford. And so they found the ford, and then they crossed the ford. The Marathas had, up until that point, defended the line of this river facing him. For some reason, like you say, it is a little puzzling why they did not notice what he noticed, but they didn't, I guess. They guarded the main fords that they thought the British would get across. The other option, of course, is that they darn well knew they had time to redeploy. And that's exactly what they did. And although Wellesley never showed his shock, he was undoubtedly surprised by the fact that by the time he had turned this flank, because his idea was, I will turn the flank, and then they'll have no choice but to either run away or fight and get defeated in detail, because he didn't think they could turn to face him fast enough. He was very surprised, therefore, to find out by the time he had deployed, they had moved over 100 guns and their entire regular infantry line to face him. Now he didn't face a flank, he faced an entire army with no flank to turn, and now he was actually trapped in like a spider in a cup with a massive army facing him. And now cannonballs were coming at him in an immense weight of shot. So much so that they killed all of his bullocks that were dragging his guns, so the guns could not advance. So he had to advance without artillery support after, basically. And it was just the most appalling mess. It was the most terrifying thing most of them had ever gone through. The Mahratta line, although it was constricted by the rivers, way outflanked their own. And if they had had a kind of a very energetic commander, who knows what could happen, to be honest. But British military doctrine always said in India, attack even if you're outnumbered. And of course, Wellesley didn't have a blinking choice here. He had to attack, so he did. The infantry line goes forward into the teeth of the guns. Cannonballs flying everywhere, people being knocked down at every step. So said one account. Wellesley riding up and down everywhere, making sure everybody's continuing to move forward. The weight of fire is so heavy that some sepoys are seen to visibly shrink from it and try and take advantage of tiny little clefts in the ground, turning their knapsacks to the weight of fire. And the entire line actually shrinks to the left because the fire is so heavy. They start to crowd in on each other for sort of security. And yet, somehow, this indomitable line of redcoats, and I'm including sepoys in this because they wore the red too, get to the gun line, fire volleys into it, and yet the Marathas don't run. They have to go in with the bayonets, because as one account said, they couldn't shift them with volley fire. And then they drove them away rather than they ran away. And they finally got through the guns. While this is happening, cavalry attack Wellesley's right flank, overrun a battalion of pickets, and I believe it is there's so many 70s in the Highland regiments, but I believe it is the 74th, overrun them. Intervention by the British and Indian cavalry saves the day. They drive the Marathas, now in a rather bad mess, back against the other river, drive them across that. The British cavalry cut them to pieces. Then he has to lead a portion of the army back to the gun line to retake it from a bunch of guys who had pretended to be dead, and roving cavalry and stuff like that. The British cavalry charge again at the fleeing enemy and get repulsed by a Kampu who shoots them down as they come at them, and Colonel Maxwell, commander of the cavalry, is killed. Wellesley loses a third of his army. It is in no fit state to pursue. He has to wait until Stevenson catches up, can tend to the wounded, and he sends Stevenson after them. This is a victory because obviously he wins the field, because he's vastly outnumbered, and for that fact, it is not gone unnoticed by the Marathas that we just got pretty heavily defeated by a tiny little bug of an army that was able to squash. So that's not good.
I mean, that puts it mildly, but yes, it is. It's a bloodbath, really.
Yeah.
It's an absolute bloodbath. It's one of those victories where everything, I think, hangs on discipline and cohesion of a force to advance under that weight of fire. There are, if you don't have that level of trust and that level of morale and that tight control, you can't do it. And yeah, like we said earlier, this idea that the Indian forces could not fight is just ludicrous. A third of the army gone. I think it's certainly one of the Highland regiments. I think it's the 74th. Am I right in thinking they stray too far north, and so they kind of end up being sandwiched between Maratha infantry on one side and then the fortifications of Assaye sort of on the other, with nowhere to go, and then, as you say, get hammered by cavalry?
Yeah, that's broadly what happens. Assaye sits on the I think it's the River Jwa side of the Assaye Doab, and it's like all towns in what is called the Deccan, which is where the campaign takes place. It's fortified with a mud wall, which the locals would have built around it to protect from Pindaris and robbers and things like that. And it was turned into a little fortress. It's at the very end of the Maratha infantry line and the gun line. And in his orders to advance, he was very worried about being outflanked because, like I said, the Maratha line was immense. And in order to do this, the British and Presidency infantry were originally in two lines. And he ordered the second line to come up onto the right hand of the first line to extend it. In order to do that, a tricky thing happens in the order of battle, because obviously you have the battalion of pickets that don't have a precedence in the line. They sit, because they are an amalgamation of the pickets of the day drawn together as a sort of an advance guard, they have to sit on the extreme side of the force, I believe, or it's, yeah, I can't remember exactly the precedence they have, but the fact they need to switch places with one of the senior King's regiments in order to fit into the line means that a gap appears in the line as it goes forward. And as the pickets move out of the way to let the 74th come into the line, they end up moving obliquely away from the main line that's going straight towards the Maratha guns. And obviously, as I said before, remember, the main line veers slightly to try and avoid the weight of fire. So a bigger gap appears. Now, for some reason, Lieutenant Colonel Orrick, who is in charge of the pickets, doesn't stop his pickets going straight towards Assaye, or at least the junction between Assaye and the gun line. And they come under increasingly heavy weight of fire. The rest of the line doesn't see this weight of fire because there's just so many guns that can now just focus on this insane batch of British people just sort of walking to their destruction. The pickets basically get shot to pieces, and the 74th walks through them, and in turn starts to get so ravaged by shot they begin to stagger and fall back because the line's almost dissolving under the weight of lead. And at this point, a sort of a hawk-eyed Maratha officer of the cavalry notices that these guys are just ripe to be run down, and he leads forward a cavalry charge. It could be one of the Peshwas. It could be one of the ministers of state, whose name I have forgotten, who actually gets killed in the battle. But this cavalry charge then hits the 74th. They try and form a rallying square. They're all alone. A lot of witnesses said they just got overrun, and if it hadn't been for the British cavalry, in fact, witnesses said they got overrun. Witnesses within the 74th say that they were left out there for a little while because they talk about instances where they could hear a British voice from the Mahratta cavalry. So you're obviously still having mercenaries out there telling people to, kill anybody you find and stuff like that, and talking about a particularly adept Mahratta cavalryman who was really, really skillful with his lance, picking off guys and riding away. And then, of course, the 19th, I think it's the 19th Light Dragoons and the 7th Native Cavalry come in and save the day. But it is pretty much they end up in a complete crossfire and take tremendous casualties. Every one of the 74th's officers, I think, gets shot.
I mean, folks will know that we have a lot of discussions with Marcus Cribb, who cites Wellington, saying that he considered Assaye to be his greatest victory.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree with that? I mean, okay, Wellington, he's the guy on the ground, he's the commander, he's the person best placed to know. But as an external observer, there's a lot that kind of goes wrong in this. This isn't, I mean, okay, Wellington much earlier in his career, but this is not a Salamanca, it's not a Vittoria, it's not even a kind of Waterloo style strategy in terms of being really carefully thought through in terms of how's this going to play out. Would you agree that this is one of Wellington's great moments, or is this just kind of one of those moments where his inexperience actually shows a fair bit?
I think there's a bit of both at play. He underestimated the Maratha's ability to fight him effectively, because he had a regular officer's trust in regular troops against what he deemed lesser grade troops. He didn't listen to a particular officer whose name, I think his name was Colonel Collins, who told him directly that you don't actually have to worry about the Mahratta cavalry. Worry about their infantry and their guns. Those will shock you. But he and the staff didn't listen to him very much, so he didn't really rate the Marathas very much. So he's definitely not appreciating his enemy in the way he appreciated Napoleon and the French, which he was very well prepared for when he went to Spain and Portugal. But at the same time, what you have is a glimpse into that kind of Salamanca intuition. His first plan goes wrong, and then he makes another call, which is the right call. You have to attack. And everything he does is essentially, like I say at the beginning, him improvising on a failed plan, because once he gets over the river, obviously he loses his guns. And then he has to think again. And then he comes up against the Mahratta line. They're not running away. We'll have to use the bayonet to get through them. He makes good provisions for the cavalry to cover his exposed flank, and he manages to control the advance of his troops to the extent that they don't get out of hand, so the Marathas don't have an opportunity to counterattack effectively. And so when I think he says in later life that Assaye was the greatest thing he ever did, you have to pay attention to what he's actually saying. He's asked, what is the greatest thing you ever did by way of fighting, or something like that. There's that one where he just replies Assaye in a kind of a haunted voice, because he was deeply affected by the carnage.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month slows. Full terms at mintmobile.com.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom, Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
And there's a version somewhere, I believe, where it's specified that he means, in terms of numbers, that it's the best thing he ever did by way of fighting. So he's talking about the fact that he has less than 10,000 men, and he goes up against somewhere in the region of, I'm not going to say it's over 40,000 men, but it's certainly it's certainly 40,000 is the upper limit of what he was up against at Assaye. And even if it's 20,000, that is not of good quality troops as well. This isn't just a rabble, as we've said. So I think that's what he means by that. And as you know, Wellington changed his opinion as to his greatest battle several times during his life. His top three was Salamanca, Vittoria, and Waterloo. No, and the top four was the Pyrenees campaign as well, which he sort of lumped into one of Sorora and stuff like that. So, but Assaye definitely rated very highly for him as a battle. Whether it reflects his finest sort of act as a general, I don't know, because obviously he called it wrong and he got himself into a bit of a situation which could have gone dramatically wrong. And it shows his qualities as a leader and certainly his tactical flair. But it's probably it is and it is not his finest hour. He was very he was very, very concerned about it actually after the battle. His letters after the battle are all about, I have lost too many men because I went off on my own without waiting for Stevenson, and people are going to crucify me for this. He was very, very, very concerned about making sure people understood he had no choice.
Can I just ask about Stevenson? Because I have a vague recollection somewhere that Stevenson went ever so slightly insane. Is that right? And if so, what kind of implications did that have for the campaign?
Stevenson, from what I know of him, was quite old at the time. And all that Wellesley ever says about him was that he was a very dependable guy. He trusted him quite a lot, and that he was ill, but I don't know what he was ill with. I know at the Battle of Augam after Assaye, when they were moving on Gawilghur, he was so ill he apparently had to sit in an elephant to command his troops. Which seems a little dramatic since presumably they had horses and litters and things, but he'd been in India for a while, so I guess he went with an elephant. And at the siege of Gawilghur, he was incapacitated again, which required Wellesley to ride up to 50 miles a day to check on the various positions around the fortress. So that, I guess, sort of sums up the effect of the other commander being rather incapacitated by something or other, just more workload on Wellesley. Because luckily it was Wellesley, so he took upon himself everything. So, Colonel Stevenson's ill. Well, I'll just leave it to his successor. No, I'll go and do it all myself.
That's very Wellesley-esque or Wellingtonian, isn't it? I'm the only one who can possibly do these things if my number two is incapacitated. Seeing as we're talking about sieges, let's discuss those a little more. I mean, there's the escalade at Ahmadnaggar and the more conventional siege operation at the fortress of Gawilghur. Operationally, how well run? And again, I'm on a Wellington bashing trend today, but how well run are they? Because as we know, sieges are not Wellington's strong point, and to some extent, the argument could be made that actually that's because of his experiences in India. So, for example, Burgos, a lot of people turn around and say, but what he's expecting at Burgos is an Indian hilltop fortress like he dealt with during these kinds of campaigns. And Burgos is a much tougher nut to crack than he anticipated. So, I mean, are these well-conducted sieges? Does he make the right calls? And would you necessarily agree with the idea that what happens during this campaign informs his later dealings with fortresses?
Yes, I think it does inform his later experience with fortresses, definitely. So Ahmadnagар is the first fortress that he attacks at the opening of the war, with the Marathas in the Deccan. He goes up against it having expected to attack it, and in fact it was actually necessary to attack it very quickly, or because it was running out of supplies. He did so, and this is another instance of him kind of making a tactical decision based on insufficient intelligence. Ahmadnagar has a Petta wall, and the Petta wall is just the wall that runs around the, in quotes, Petta, which is the town, the civilian town that sits below the fortress. The idea is to get through that. And naturally enough, from a European point of view, you would therefore attack the curtain walls between the towers. Unfortunately, a lot of Indian fortresses don't see the real need to put a walkway on a curtain wall that surrounds a town. And so the first attack was repulsed because when the scaling ladders, when they got up the scaling ladders, there was nothing to stand on except like a half a foot little shelf. And that was a bit of a mess. But luckily some rather spirited officers, I believe, Lieutenant or Captain Colin Campbell, not of Crimea fame, I think this is a different Colin Campbell. Practically everybody is called Colin Campbell with the name Campbell. But he then leads this party of the 78th up a tower and takes that. And then the gates, I believe, are blown at roughly the same instant as the guys who have managed to wheedle their way inside get round to the gatehouse. So that was Ahmadnagar, and therefore, again, he didn't really have any information. He could have asked his Maratha allies about where to attack first, but apparently he didn't. Nevertheless, his Maratha allies, remember the Peshwas on his side technically, they were very impressed by the fact that he just looked at it and attacked it and did take it in a day. But obviously it could have gone smoother. With Gawilghur is actually a much smoother operation and very impressive, actually. It's a very impressive looking place. It is literally sitting on top of a sheer cliff, and it's got two sections to it connected by a bridge. And the only way to get to the section that's accessible is to go through the mountainous terrain and get up onto a plateau that slightly overlooks it. And this is very impractical for guns, but nevertheless, Stevenson's column does this, establishes batteries in front of that gate, digs some trenches for cover. Meanwhile, Wellesley conducts siege operations below the fortress, sort of keep people occupied. And obviously he has to ride it. He has to do most of the things himself because Stevenson's ill for most of the attack. And then they assault it successfully and take it, despite the fact there is no breach in the second portion of the fortress. That they have to do some gymnastics to try and get across the bridge and scale the cliff to get over the walls on that one as well. So Gawilghur is actually quite a smooth operation, comparatively speaking. But having said that, there's no doubt in my mind, and based on the fact that he later actually identifies that Burgos was, it's a quote, he goes that it was not unlike many hill forts in India, and I'd got into a great many of those, but it was defended by a very clever fellow. After Salamanca, India mode kicks in with Wellington. And up until this point, he has been nothing in India up until the Second Mahratta War. If you had looked at his record, it would be attack, 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 logistics, 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 logistics. No defense whatsoever in his record. He chases people down, he leads cavalry charges, he fights insurgents. This is not the Wellesley, this is not the Wellington people know from the Peninsula. There's a bit of Bonaparte's dash in him at this point, actually. And so when he sees people running, and he had the French running after Salamanca, India mode kicks in. I'll chase them, and all the cities will surrender as I get to them, or I'll take them really quickly because the heart has gone out of them. So I think that's definitely something that stayed with him. And he had to sort of control it because he was fighting the French. And also, it has to be said that the garrison of Gawilghur had received directly. The garrison of Gawilghur was made up by people who had escaped the Battle of Algon, and so they weren't in a great state themselves. So,
sure. I mean, one of the things that we've touched already on issues of race and racial attitudes during this period, and what's quite striking actually is that yes, there are some inclinations to underestimate the ability of the Maratha forces, but in terms of racialized attitudes, not much earlier than this point, you've got people senior figures out in India, who have married local ladies and are quite content to be portrayed with their wives of a different, I'm going to use inverted commas here, of a different race. I dislike the term hugely, but folks can get the thrust of what I'm getting at here. So quite proud of the fact that they have married somebody of a different ethnicity. So we've talked about the fighting. What about the treatment of prisoners of war? Because obviously any fighting, you have prisoners on both sides. And this picture is complicated by the fact that for Maratha troops, they're fighting, yes, British regular forces, but they're also fighting sepoys. So do we have any evidence of stigma? Is there evidence of Indian sepoys being treated differently from their white colleagues if they became prisoners, or do we just not have any evidence of that at all?
I think there is, yes, some evidence of the treatment of prisoners. The most famous treatment of prisoners in an Indian context will be the treatment of the prisoners in Mysore after the would be the second or third Mysore Wars, but I'm a little sketchy on it. Anyway, General Baird, obviously being locked in a dungeon with an untreated wound alongside private soldiers who are basically just left to die in a semi-flooding hellhole, it would appear. So just because you were a European doesn't mean you're necessarily treated better. It kind of depended on what the goal of the opposing forces were. You know, whether they wanted to be kind to the prisoners in order to try and get a better deal, or whether they were fighting to the death, in which case they would just do terrible things to you. And obviously he's an officer at that time as well, so that's not a good sign for private European soldiers. As for the way that sepoys would be treated, again, I think it depends sort of on the war aims of the guy who catches them. I think the best example that I can think of would be to go to our friend Yashwantrao Holkar, who is just epic guy. You know, he's this merciless, one-eyed, hard-drinking, hard-riding, womanizing legend who happens to, unfortunately for the British, have a rather quite a talent for mounted warfare. And he destroyed a detachment of sepoy, of presidency soldiers under Colonel Monson. I think it was in 1804. Completely wiped it out. Wiped it out. He destroyed it as an effective force. And one of the things that he did while he had it on the run was continually send people out to the sepoys to try and get them to desert. And he would use arguments about the why are you fighting for these foreigners? Come and fight with us. We're your brothers, kind of thing. And he would promise them incentives. He would give them a bounty, give them a woman. He would try to give incentives to them to desert. And so if you deserted, and if you had the offer and you deserted, and it was quite common to bribe people in Indian warfare. A lot of battles throughout India had been turned by one side or another managing to pay off somebody not to turn up or to turn coat in the middle of a battle and stuff like that. So this is completely within the realm of usual business. If you deserted to him, you'd probably get a decent spot in the army, even though you had been fighting him. If you were captured, on the other hand, that's a little trickier. It's known that in this precise instance, after Monson's defeat, that a lot of sepoys did desert, but some of them were captured, and some of even the people who did desert to Holkar were very badly treated and mutilated, actually. And the sight of these poor wretches coming back to the British side actually stopped the desertion of the sepoys, which had been very worrying to the British authorities around Delhi at the time. And so, again, it sort of depends. I don't think there's one rule for how they were treated. It depended whether you needed the troops for the army, in which case you encourage desertion, you don't treat them badly, you give them lots of money and things like that. Try to appeal to what is very common in the military culture of South Asia, which is obviously people in India have been fighting each other for a very long time. And the British were, to some extent, by local populations, seen as the newest kid on the block. They're offering money for service. I am a soldier, I have a hereditary duty to fight. My father fought, we were warriors, things like that. They want to pay me to fight, I'll fight for them. And obviously, if someone else is offering better prospects in the military economy of the time, then you go to them. It's as simple as that, whoever is doing the best. And obviously the British outperformed the in quotes country powers in this recruitment area to offer better incentives for their sepoys, I guess. But generally speaking, if things are going bad, you could desert and you would probably do all right. But on the other hand, you had to watch it because sometimes you'll be made an example of. So it's a difficult question to answer precisely, but it's not necessarily the case that just because the British are foreigners, their troops would be considered traitors to India, because there is no concept of India as India. People know it as a geographic expression, but most of the people who fought the British had nothing in common with the people fighting alongside the British. The Marathas hated Hyderabad. The Marathas hated Mysore, Muslim and Hindu powers. So religion and things like that were more common problems to deal with, I think.
I mean, you've talked about desertion, which, as far as I'm concerned, is an open invitation to start discussing discipline. So listeners can groan away at my self-indulgence of shoehorning, discussions of discipline into almost every single interview. But given an opportunity, I will take it. Let's talk about the British and a pretty patchy record when it comes to sieges generally, but most famously in the context of India specifically, at Seringapatam, after its capture in 1799, I know not part of the Maratha and Jat campaigns, but nonetheless part of this push to expand British control into the subcontinent. I mean, people are bound to ask, to what extent is Seringapatam driven by race? Personally, I look at what happens at Seringapatam, and then I look at what happens at Ciudad Rodrigo and Burgos, not at Burgos, at Badajoz, and at San Sebastian, and you can see the direct line. They're doing exactly the same thing, not because of race, it's because that's what British soldiers do when they've taken a town by storm and have the ability to plunder. So that's just my perspective. So I guess my first question is, what's your perspective? And then as a follow-on, what's the situation like after the taking of Ahmadnaggar and Gawilghur?
Yeah, I agree with you on the first score. The treatment by a British soldier after he's got into a city after a storm is the treatment he meets out to a Indian, we'll say Hindu or Muslim, is not all that different to what he meets out to a Portuguese or Spanish Catholic. I don't know what it would be like precisely if this happened in a Protestant country, i.e.
Well, I mean, the point of comparison there, I guess, is the American War of Independence / American Revolution, whichever folks prefer to describe it as, in which actually there's a lot of evidence coming out increasingly that the British were really quite appalling. There seems oddly to be more evidence of sexual assault during the American War of Independence than there is for the Peninsular War. And that's not to say that sexual assault did not happen during the Peninsular War, or indeed necessarily during the India campaigns. It's simply an indication that there's been the ability to dig that up. So, I mean,
yes, I remember some things that were said about 1776 when they invaded again and landed on Long Island. That basically no woman was safe around the camp, basically. So yes, I think that's a legitimate point of comparison as well. Then, yeah, this is just what happens. This is just the army. This is just what you've got in the army. This is just. It depends as well on the general and how strict he is about trying to control the, in quotes, worst excesses of the troops, you might call it. Yeah, I agree. I don't think this is a particularly racial thing, nor can it be properly argued that it's a religious thing, although certainly Catholics, Hindus, and Muslims would be seen as somewhat less important in terms of how you treat them. That can't actually explain anything more. No, it can't really get to the heart of the motive of why these things happen. This is more to do with in the subject of sieges and storms, of a kind of a bestial nature that is unleashed in the process of having to storm a breach. It seems that to storm a breach, you need to let that iron discipline of linear warfare relax, so you can scramble up a rubble-strewn slope and use your bayonet to stab your way into the city. Officers have much less control of their troops in that situation, and that's why a general reserve is always needed to try and get into the city to make sure it surrenders properly after the stormers have basically lost control and spread out. Because as we also know, rules of war as they stand, if you storm a city, you're allowed to sack it. So,
I mean, I always question that one, because that's meant to go back to medieval styles of warfare. And my understanding was that you could put the garrison to the sword as opposed to there being a convention that if the city stands the assault, then you can physically sack it.
It's certainly one of the unwritten rules, basically. You are allowed to execute the entire garrison. Again, unwritten rule. A lot of people did it when they, like Genghis Khan, would make an example of a city that resisted him and execute the garrisons and stuff like that. So it was an accepted, I feel personally, it's an accepted form of warfare, that if you have to waste your troops when ostensibly you can no longer hold the town, I mean, you can theoretically, but at a massive cost. If you force me to expend the lives of my men, I will make you suffer, basically. So that is where I think it comes from. Soldiers by, I think, the 19th century, I don't know if you agree or not, seemed to have the impression that they had the right to do whatever they wanted, certainly. Yeah. And generals tended to give them at least 24 hours before trying to stop them whenever that happened. And some people were terribly egregious about it and would just let the looting continue ad infinitum. But in the terms, I think you're right about the fact that this is just more a byproduct of the British 18th, 19th century army, rather than those people are different and there we must treat them as such. I think that probably was a consideration within the ranks. I doubt you could say that the British Army of the 19th century was particularly enlightened in terms of race, but I don't think you can say their motives for sacking a place was because they didn't like Indians or Spaniards. I think it's because they wanted the loot and they wanted the women. And especially in terms of Seringapatam, that was a very rich city. And the loot they got out of that was ridiculous. Ahmadnaggar is another instance. It's an old city. It's quite rich. It's got a large civil town in it. So there was at least a day or so or several hours where looting happened. This was all for some reason strangely blamed on the sepoys by the British officers, which is probably, I mean, I'm almost certain it's unfair to say that was all the sepoys' fault. And I think 2 sepoys were hanged to make sure that it stopped, because Wellesley was in command, and that was pretty much how he stopped looting, was to start hanging people. And maybe that also informed some of his attempts to stop the looting in Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz, because again, he resorts to building a gallows. He said, I'm going to start hanging people now, so stop it. And because that's what he did in India, perhaps. Maybe that's something he picked up there. But with Gawilghur, that's more of a fortress in the purest sense. There's not much of a civilian population. It's built as a military, basically, installation. And although there is a civilian population in it, it's mostly the civilians of the garrison in it. And sadly, a lot of them chose to die rather than be captured. Now, some of this may be propaganda. Some of it may not be true, or it might be inflated. Some people say everybody died. Some people say the majority died. And there is at least 2 accounts that talk of a specific thing that would happen amongst the Rajputs and things like that, and people of that persuasion, that they would kill their own families rather than let them fall into the hands of the enemy. And that certainly seems to have happened at Gawilghur as well. But as to the misbehavior of the troops, there wasn't so much of that, although I do remember a very interesting account by Roderick Eanes, who was a soldier in the 78th Foot. And he, as a private soldier, I should add, is interesting because in later life he did a memoir. Now he implies that the storming party got out of hand and just started killing people. He doesn't directly say it, but it's the implication there that because the garrison continued to fight, they were pursued through the streets and essentially not allowed to surrender. So there's something happened at Gawilghur, but I'm not particularly sure if we can get to the bottom of what that was. It seems to be more militarily driven, that one, than after loot, because there wasn't any real loot in the place. Also, Wellesley got into that place very quickly after they stormed it, as if he was definitely going to try and make sure he got the troops in hand pretty fast.
So what's the legacy of the campaign, whether it be for British control of India, whether it's for the locals or for Wellesley himself?
Well, the Second Mahratta War doesn't end like everybody thinks it ends. It doesn't end after the capture of Gawilghur and the surrender of Davatra Sind. It ends in around sometime in 1805, late 1805, I believe, when Lake, the commander-in-chief in India, there is a governor-general and there is a commander-in-chief. General Gerard Lake, one of the old school. He's a very popular fellow. He's called Lik Sab Bahadur by the Sawars of the Bengal cavalry. He's much more popular than Wellesley is, but he's not as professional. And he's an old chap. He's of the class of Abercrombie and these old bewigged fellows who were hard riders and good old boys and things like that. He leads the campaign through Hindustan, takes Delhi, gets control of the Sultan. He's able to do this mostly because Governor General Richard Wellesley had the bright idea to bribe off all of the European officers in the regular corps of the Maratha army as soon as the war was declared, and an awful lot of them left Maratha service, which is another reason. As I said, this is the basic reason why I said the Maratha regulars were not able to perform very well, because they lost most of their officers. And so he takes Delhi, and then he defeats the rest of Scindia's troops. I should say the British call him Scindia. He's often also called Shind, and I call him Shind because I'm ornery. And he defeats the rest of the regular corps in Hindustan. And then he goes off chasing Holkar around the small Rajput kingdoms, which are to the west of Delhi. And this is where Monson's disaster happens. A corps gets wiped out when Lake thinks all is over, he's gone home. And then he has to come back and chase Holkar again. And he ends up trying to take the Jat fortress of Bharatpur. Now, in terms of talking about sieges, this one is not on anyone's map because Wellington wasn't there. And it is an unmitigated disaster. The British have never failed to take a place in India almost on the first try. He tried 4 times to storm Bharatpur, and each time he was repulsed. The Jats put up the most ridiculous defense you've ever seen against the greatest, in quotes, fortress breakers India had seen since the Mughals, and they showed him the door. Everybody was absolutely stunned by this. It got so bad that King's troops, Lake's favorite troops, because he relied totally on Europeans and got them all shot to pieces to win his battles, they refused to advance out of their trenches because they said, we're not going to go and get murdered trying to attack that thing again. And so the officer in charge turned to the reserve regiment of sepoys. And it's one of the great moments of the Indian Army that these guys, without complaint, just go up against the walls and get basically shot down because the Europeans wouldn't do it. And for a brief moment, one of the colors of the native infantry regiments flies from the parapet, proving that they managed to get up there. But it's appalling, the whole thing. And Lake can't take it. Instead, he has to go and chase Holkar up into Punjab to desperately try and make sure he doesn't make peace with Ranjit Singh of the Sikhs. And there he manages to get him to make a peace treaty. And then he makes a peace treaty, and he makes a peace treaty with the Raja of Bharatpur as well, where he says, where it's obviously a climb down. Basically, he accepts a very large bribe, basically, for war indemnities, and a slap on the wrist for fighting the British, and then just awkwardly goes home and never speaks of it again. But so this is the sour taste of the Second Mahratta War. The Maratha power is broken, no doubt about it. As a political power, they have lost their center of power. They're no longer able to really resist the British, although there is a third war after the Napoleonic War's end. It's not a very satisfactory ending to the war, but it achieves essentially what Richard Wellesley wanted and extends British power up to the line of the Himalayas and the Punjab and as far south as the tip of India, pretty much. But of course, not everybody in Whitehall's happy about what he's been up to. He's been fighting ridiculously expensive wars for vague ideas about a subsidiary plan that nobody really likes except him. Not even Arthur Wellesley likes it. He's really ticked off with Richard because he treats India so shabbily after he makes peace, because Arthur had been very generous in his terms with him, and Richard is just all hardline. He's saying, and Arthur goes, if we can't get these people to trust us, what's even the point? So, I mean, he'd been on record as being against the idea of fighting the Marathas like this from the beginning. He actually just wanted to restore the Peshawar, install a garrison in Poon, and go home, basically, and let Bajirao figure it out himself. So this brings British power in India to almost its height. Like you're saying at the beginning, actually, we're actually closer to the end than we are to the beginning now, actually. In the 1840s, they fight the last great war of conquest against the Sikhs and conquer the last major part of India that they don't already own. But the Marathas were, up until that point, the last great power standing in their way. And so the result of the Second Mahratta War is incredibly important for the history of India. For Wellesley himself, Richard Wellesley, for a start, gets recalled for his dodgy dealings because nobody trusts him to be in India alone anymore. And Arthur Wellesley comes back pretty rich, nice suntan, feeling kind of ill though. He's pretty much sure he's going to die if he stays in India much longer, because he's been getting increasingly more unhealthy in terms of in terms of his well-being. He's been sick quite a lot, and he comes back as a successful general, but an India general, and nobody really credits India generals as being any good. And that's unfortunately a legacy that comes down to today, that nobody thinks fighting in India proves you're much good at soldiering. Although anybody who had fought in India would have said that except for a hard winter's campaign, there was nothing like fighting in India for hardships. So I think that sort of wraps that sort of, I think that answers the question. Arthur Wellesley's now setting up for coming onto the stage, proving himself in the European theatre. And India, well, bureaucrats and lawmakers and administrators now have to figure out how to administrate this massive subcontinent that Richard Wellesley has just handed to them, with all its expensive subsidiary treaties that they have to now find a way to make work.
Josh, as always, it's been an absolute delight. It's always a pleasure to just sit here and just let your knowledge wash over me. It's incredible how you managed to retain all this inside your head, frankly. So your book, Bullocks, Grain and Good Madeira, is coming out from Hellion. Folks can pre-order, I believe, at hellion.co.uk. Please do, folks. I'm sure you'll have enjoyed this as much as I have. Go away, click that link, order this book, because it's going to be an entertaining read for you, I suspect. Josh, thank you a huge amount.
Very grateful for the opportunity to talk about it. I think I can actually leave you with a very nice little tidbit, actually.
Go for it.
Which is this. Not long after he left India, Wellesley said that he had tested the sepoys on many occasions and they had never let him down. And that when Napoleon came to St. Helena, he met the governor there, the one that was before Sir Hudson Lowe. And he said, and he got into a conversation with Napoleon about India. And Napoleon, not knowing anything about India, asked him, because the governor had fought it in Mysore, are the Indians all cowards because they allow you to run the country, basically? And he said that it was certainly not the case, that although he decided that Europeans were naturally stronger soldiers, the sepoys never lacked in courage. And then, trying to trick him, Boney said, but would you rate them as high as British soldiers? And the governor replied, the finest of them, yes.
It's a good little anecdote. And we managed to squeeze some Boney bashing in there as well. Josh, always a pleasure. Thanks very much again.
Thank you.
That was Josh Provan, the author of Bullocks, Grain and Good Madeira, joining me to talk about the Mahratta and Jat campaigns of the early 1800s, which forms the focus of his book. As you heard, both of Josh's titles are available on the Napoleonicist bookstore. Bullocks, Grain and Good Madeira is actually on pre-order, as it comes out in the middle of next month. Click the link in the description, and in the process of buying there, you'll be supporting not only Josh but also the Napoleonicist. Alternatively, you can order direct at hellion.co.uk. A big thank you, as ever, to my Napoleonicist patrons. Full details on how you can support and influence the content of this podcast are also available in the link in the description. Particular shout-outs to my Commander patron, Ger Brown, and my Mentioned in Dispatches patrons, Alex Churchill, Anna Vakulenko, Beatrice de Graaf, Brendan Teeling, an anonymous Canadian, Gareth Copeland, James Bevan, Jamie Kingston, Jim Deary, John Haynes, Josh Keeney, Lucy Tatner, Lynn Dawson, Rob Griffith, and Rory Muir. Remember that you can find me on Twitter at ZWhiteHistory and in the forum at thenapoleonicwars.net. I'll be back in a fortnight, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been The Napoleonicist. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.
The biggest names in tennis are coming to Paris for the most anticipated Roland Garros in years. Tennis Channel Plus is your place to watch. Stream every court from your phone or smart TV live in HD. Experience 3 weeks of unparalleled tournament access as the world's top players in tennis face off against each other. Will the veteran champions continue their dominance, or will a fresh face emerge to challenge their legacy on the clay courts? Daily live coverage of this epic showdown begins Monday, May 20th. Don't miss a matchup. Stream it now with Tennis Channel Plus to be there when it happens.
Planning for your next trip? Elevate your travel style with Quince. Quince has all the jet-setting essentials you'll want for your next getaway, like European linen, premium luggage options, buttery soft Italian leather bags, and so much more. And it's all priced at 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Plus, Quince only works with factories that use safe and ethical manufacturing practices. Pack your bags with high-quality essentials you'll be wearing for vacations to come with Quince. Go to quince.com/trip for free shipping and 365-day returns.